Hi everyone, Nigel Saunders here. Welcome to part 2 of summer work on my larch forest. In part 1 of this series, I plucked out the first flush of growth needles, the longer needles from spring. So now the trees just have their second flush of growth needles on the trees, which are much smaller because each flush of growth gets a little weaker as the summer goes on. So I'm preparing the trees for their third flush of growth. And when that comes in, I can then remove all my second flush of growth needles, keeping the vigor of the trees down to a minimum. I also thinned out the foliage, removing all the needles from the underside of the branches, just to get more light down to the lower branches and to the interior of the forest. I also took advantage of any back budding, bringing the branches back closer to the trunk line to get a tighter conical shape to the trees. I also did my major weeding of the landscape, pulling out all the weeds, roots and all. Now I've got to clean up the liverwort that's in the landscape. Here's a look at all the liverwort that's growing in on the landscape. So I'll have to remove that as step number 1. Liverwort can be hard to remove, but if you just keep at it, picking it out, eventually you get rid of it. Or you keep it under control anyway. As I'm working away in the landscape, I'll also remove any needles that have fallen down on the landscape. Just doing a general cleanup, and then I'll come in and work on the moss. I'm starting this work early in the morning today because it is going to be a hot and humid day today, up to 30 degrees Celsius, which is like in the 80s Fahrenheit. I've got all the fans on in the greenhouse and trying to keep it as cool as possible for as long as possible. I'm cleaning out my bear cave here. Hopefully there's no bears inside. There, the bear cave looks dark and mysterious. I've got the waterfall cleaned up, looking good once again. I've got my water area all cleaned up now. It's looking nice, the shoreline. Coming along. So next I'm going to switch over to this side and get this all cleaned up. So I haven't pruned any moss yet. I'm just cleaning it up first, and then I'll come in and prune up the moss bushes. I have got the front of the planting all cleaned up. Needles, liverwort, weeds. So I'm going to rotate the forest around to the back now. Here's a look at the back of the forest. So it's not too bad weed-wise. I just need to clean up the needles, and then I can rotate it back to the front and begin the moss pruning. The back of the landscape is cleaned up now, so I'll rotate it back to the front and I'll start pruning the moss. I've got my curved scissors, so I can come in. There's a few brown tips on the moss, so I'll just kind of shape the bushes a bit, pruning off those brown tips. And then I want to get some definition in the bushes so they're not just blobs. So I will kind of make distinct shapes. So you can see I've got a bit of definition here now. It's not just one smooth, layer of moss. It looks a little more miniature. Now that's the aim, is just to create a miniature looking landscape. You can also come in with the tweezers, and between your bushes you can pick out the moss, and it'll help define the bushes. And I find, even though you're pulling the moss out, you get a finer layer grow in that space, and it looks really good because you get a variety of heights of your moss. That moss has good definition now. And then I'll just kind of shorten around it. And there's a moss bush. So I'll work on the one up here next. So now I'm getting 3 distinct bushes, this one, and this one. And it's just like the canopy on your tree. The more you kind of separate your branches, the more miniature it looks. It looks to be a smaller scale value because it's more detailed. So there's 3 distinct bushes now, and it's subtle, but they're there, and it just helps define the landscape, so it's not like up here, which is just all smooth and blobby looking. And whatever you pull out, don't worry, it always fills in again, if your conditions are right for growing moss. So I'm starting to get more definition up here, separating this bush, this one, creating some darks and lights. When you pull out the moss, you get some darkness in the forest, some shadows. So you can see this bush is really nicely defined now. And all this work, when it comes time to show your tree, you know, it's less work to get it ready for the show if you do all the work midsummer like this. Keep up with the maintenance, and yeah, that's looking quite nice. I've got all kinds of distinct bushes, so now I'll separate this one. Holding my bushes in place as I pull the moss out around them. And I want some areas that don't have moss. If you go into a forest, it's not all a carpet of moss unless you're in a rainforest. Usually you have, pathways and variety. That's what I'm trying to say, is you want variety in your landscape. You don't want it all to look the same. It just makes it more interesting. I took out a big clump of moss there, and it really improves it. Looks like there's kind of a pathway up to the tree here. So you can see that hill has gone from, quite plain looking, just sort of a covering of moss, to very detailed now. And it just adds to that miniature look. It makes your eye explore the landscape. Whereas this section's just all big and blobby looking, and it just doesn't look as miniature. I find this landscape work to be very creative, very satisfying when you see it all finished. So I'll work away at it, and then we'll come back and have a look at the landscape. It's getting quite warm in the greenhouse, so I'm keeping everything misted, keeping the larches nice and cool as I work away on the landscape. I do love the wet look of the landscape. I think it looks like it just rained and everything's lush and green, and yeah, it's a nice image when everything's wet. I'm liking the lighting on the landscape now. You get kind of dappled shade. Nice to get those lights and darks. I'm beginning to work over on this side. The moss on this side is getting very thick and needs some thinning. I'm starting with just kind of an overall trim of the moss, reducing it back. Otherwise you get a super thick layer, and it's hard to manage. You can see I'm taking it down to where the moss is starting to turn brown. And that helps thin it. It'll green up again, and then you can take it down a little further. So you got to keep up with the moss, otherwise it gets too thick and you just have to peel it off and plant new moss, which I prefer to keep it planted and just keep it under control if possible. So you can see the layers thinning out. Now it's very even here, so I need to break it up. Again, you know, you can pull it out with tweezers or scissor prune it. So it's just not one big flat area of moss. It's got some contours and some interest. I will use the tweezers here and just pull out clumps of it. Like that. Clump here. And I'll pull it back from the shoreline a bit too. Getting a little, well, it's starting to invade on my shoreline a bit too much. Take the moss away from my rock here. Again, there's no point having rocks in your landscape if you can't see them. They just weigh the landscape down and make your pot heavier. That big chunk out there. That looks better. So this is the shoreline, and you know, you want clumps to look like bushes and that growing near the water's edge. If you have it all even, it just doesn't look right. And all these areas I'm pulling out, they'll fill in with moss again, but it'll be much shorter than the rest, and it'll look really nice. It'll look lush but interesting. We'll have all this variation in height, shapes. Yeah, that's looking much better. I really like it now. It's looks more like a water's edge. Now I've got my moss out front here is getting too thick, and well, it's invading on the water, so I need to pluck that back and make it a little more subtle. So it's broken up into 3 clumps now. And I'll also prune it down in height just a little bit too. Now I've got quite a big thick clump here, so I need to trim that back a bit. That's looking better. I think these bushes up front, as nice as they are, they're just a little close together. Maybe a little large. That's looking good. My larch landscape is all pruned up. The landscape is all trimmed up. Let's go in now and have a look at it. I really enjoyed working on my larch forest over the last 2 days. It was a lot of meticulous work, but I'm really happy with the results. That is all for today. I'm Nigel Saunders. Thanks for joining me in the Bonsai Zone.